My name is Rachel Kessler. I am 34 years old. For 6 years, I paid my parents' mortgage. On the day my daughter turned 5, not one person from my family walked through the door. But what happened 3 weeks later, when they realized what I had actually done with their names on my spreadsheet, is something none of us will forget. I want to tell you how I got there. Because it didn't start with a missed birthday party. It started years earlier, with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the older of 2 kids. My brother Tyler was born 4 years after me, and from the moment I can remember anything, the house ran on a kind of math I didn't understand yet. If Tyler broke something, it was an accident. If I broke something, it was carelessness. If Tyler forgot his homework, he was still figuring things out. If I forgot mine, I was old enough to know better. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about cartoon villains. My parents, Diane and Roger, weren't cruel people. They didn't yell. They didn't hit us. They just had a quiet, permanent certainty about which of their children needed protecting and which one could handle things. I could handle things. So I did. I thought that just meant I'd grow up a little tougher than other kids. I had no idea what it would actually cost me. By the time I was 14, I was babysitting 3 nights a week to pay for my own school supplies because money was tight that month, even though Tyler got a brand new bike for his birthday that same year. By 16, I had a job at a sandwich shop on Wayne Avenue, and I gave half of every paycheck to my mom for groceries, even though I never saw a receipt and never asked for one. I just assumed that was what good daughters did. Tyler didn't work a single shift in high school. He played travel baseball. My parents drove 2 hours each way to watch his games, and when I made the honor roll 3 semesters in a row, my dad said, "That's great, kiddo," while looking at his phone. I'm not telling you this to make you cry for a 16-year-old's allowance money. I'm telling you because it's the blueprint. Everything that happened 20 years later was built on this exact foundation. The idea, absorbed so early I never questioned it, that my job in this family was to give, and Tyler's job was to receive. I remember one specific afternoon when I was 17, sitting at the kitchen table with my dad's old calculator, trying to figure out if I had enough saved to cover both my car insurance and a graphing calculator the school required for AP Calculus. I was $40 short. I asked my mom if she could cover the difference, just this once, and she said money was tight because they'd just put a deposit down on a used truck for Tyler, who was 13 and wouldn't be driving for 3 more years. I ended up selling my old bike on a community board to make up the difference. Nobody asked where the bike went. I don't think anyone noticed it was gone. I got a scholarship to the University of Dayton, lived at home to save money, and worked 2 jobs through college. Mornings at a campus, coffee cart, evenings doing data entry for a local insurance office. I graduated with a degree in accounting and almost no debt, which felt like a miracle at the time, the kind of quiet personal victory nobody in my family ever asked me about. Tyler dropped out of Wright State after 3 semesters, having changed his major twice and his mind a dozen more times. Nobody in my family called it a failure. They called it Tyler finding himself. I met my husband, Mark, during my second year at a mid-sized accounting firm downtown. He was an electrician, steady, funny, the kind of person who noticed things other people missed. On our third date, I told him about giving my parents money in high school, expecting him to laugh it off as a normal teenage thing. He didn't laugh. He just got quiet and said, "That's not normal, Rachel. That's a kid supporting adults." I brushed it off. I told him it wasn't a big deal. I had no idea how many more times I'd hear some version of that sentence from him over the next decade, and how many more times I'd brush it off. We got married when I was 26. 2 years later, our daughter Sophie was born, and that's really where this story begins to pick up speed. In 2018, my dad lost his job at the manufacturing plant where he'd worked for 19 years. He was 58, and finding something comparable at that age, in that industry, in that part of Ohio, was close to impossible. My mom worked part-time at a dental office and brought in maybe $1,400 a month. Their mortgage was $1,380. You don't need an accounting degree to see the problem there, but I happened to have one, and I was the one who did the math out loud during a phone call on a Tuesday night in March. We just need a little help until your dad finds something, my mom said. A few months, tops. I said yes immediately. Of course I said yes. They were my parents, they were drowning, and I had just gotten a raise. I started sending them $1,500 a month to cover the mortgage and keep the lights on. Mark and I talked about it, and he agreed it made sense, short term, with an end date. The end date never came. My dad did get part-time work eventually, stocking shelves overnight at a hardware store, but it paid $11 an hour and he could only manage 4 shifts a week because of his back. The $1,500 a month kept going, month after month. I set it up as an automatic transfer so I wouldn't forget, the same way you'd set up a car payment, except a car payment ends. I thought I had no idea how long this would actually go on, or what it would eventually reveal about how my parents saw me. I was wrong on both counts. By 2019, Tyler had moved back in with our parents after a relationship ended, and he stayed for what was supposed to be a few weeks while he got back on his feet. He was 26 years old. He did not get a job during those few weeks. He did not get a job during the months after those few weeks. My parents told me he was going through a hard time and needed space to heal. Meanwhile, Sophie was born in November of that year, and I went back to work after 12 weeks because we needed my income and because my mother, who lived 40 minutes away and was not employed full-time, told me she really couldn't commit to regular babysitting because she was still helping Tyler figure things out. I found a daycare instead. It cost $1,100 a month. I never once asked my parents to pay any part of it. I never expected them to. What I expected, naively, was that they might offer. They did not offer. What they did do, in January of 2020, was call me to say Tyler needed a little bridge money to get a car so he could start interviewing for jobs. I sent him $800. He did not get a job. The car, I found out 2 years later, was sold within 4 months because he couldn't make the insurance payments, which my parents had quietly been covering by skipping a few of their own mortgage payments. The mortgage I was sending $1,500 a month specifically to cover. I had no idea about that yet. That discovery comes later, and when it does, it changes everything. I want to pause here and talk about the version of my family that existed in public, because it matters for what comes next. At every holiday, every gathering, my parents introduced me as our responsible one, the accountant. They said it with pride, like it was a compliment. It took me years to understand it wasn't really a compliment. It was a job description. I had been hired, without ever applying, for the role of the family's financial backstop, and the title came with no salary and no thanks. Tyler, meanwhile, was still finding his path, between things, figuring it out. He was 30 years old by 2023 and had held 4 jobs in 5 years, none for longer than 7 months. Every time he lost one, my parents had an explanation that wasn't his fault. The manager was unfair. The commute was too far. The hours didn't work with his sleep schedule. I never once heard my parents ask Tyler why he kept losing jobs. I heard them ask me, constantly, why I always seemed stressed, and whether Mark and I were doing okay financially, as though my stress might be a personal failing rather than the predictable result of paying 2 mortgages worth of bills every month while raising a toddler. In the summer of 2022, my grandmother, my mom's mother, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor who lived 2 states away in Pennsylvania, came to visit for a week. She'd raised 4 kids, mostly on her own after my grandfather passed young, and she had a way of seeing through performances that the rest of the family had long since stopped noticing in each other. She watched the whole rhythm of our family up close for the first time in years. The calls from my mom asking for money, the way Tyler showed up to dinner and left without offering to help clean, the way nobody asked me how work was going, but everybody asked if I could help out a little with something. On the 3rd night, after Sophie was asleep, Eleanor sat with me on the back porch with 2 cups of decaf and asked the question that I now think of as the real beginning of this story. "Rachel, honey, why are you still doing this?" I didn't have an answer. I just said, "Because they're my parents," like that explained anything. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment, the way she used to look at me when I was a kid and had clearly broken something but hadn't admitted it yet. Being someone's daughter isn't a job, sweetheart, she said. You can stop clocking in. And the people who actually love you don't need you to clock in at all. They'd rather see you sitting still than watch you running yourself into the ground for their comfort. I thought about that sentence for weeks afterward. I wasn't ready to act on it yet. I wish I could tell you I was braver, faster, smarter about all of this. I wasn't. I kept sending the $1,500 a month. I kept saying yes. But something in me had shifted, quietly, the way a crack starts in a windshield long before the glass actually breaks. The next 18 months were more of the same, except the numbers kept climbing. In late 2022, my parents asked if I could help cover Tyler's car insurance for just a couple months while he got settled into a new sales job. I said yes. That couple months became 14 months, totaling $2,660, because the sales job lasted 9 weeks before Tyler was let go for missing too many shifts. In early 2023, my dad needed a procedure on his shoulder that insurance only partially covered. I paid $3,200 out of pocket without hesitation, because that's what you do for a parent's health, and I don't regret that part even now. What I do think about is that 2 months later, I found out, through my mother mentioning it casually on the phone, that they had used $4,000 of their own savings that same month to help Tyler with a security deposit on an apartment, money they apparently had the whole time. I didn't say anything in that moment. I just felt something cold settle in my stomach. By the time Sophie turned 5 in November of 2023, I had been sending my parents money in one form or another for nearly 6 years. I went back through my bank statements months later, after everything came out, and added it up out of a kind of grim curiosity. The number was $97,400. Mortgage support, medical costs, Tyler's bridge money, birthday gifts that were really just cash handed over because things were tight, holiday meals I paid for and then was thanked for cooking, never for funding. Mark had stopped commenting on individual transfers by then. He'd just look at me sometimes, not angry, just sad, and say, "You know this isn't going to stop on its own, right?" I told him I knew. I didn't actually know. Not yet. Knowing it in your head and knowing it in your gut are two very different things, and my gut hadn't caught up. What I had no idea about, the week of Sophie's 5th birthday, was that my family was about to show me, in the most undeniable way possible, exactly how little any of it had ever meant to them. Sophie's birthday was on a Saturday. I'd planned it 3 weeks in advance. A small party at a trampoline park, just 12 kids from her kindergarten class, plus family. I sent my parents the date and time in our family group chat on a Tuesday. My mom responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Tyler didn't respond at all, but he'd seen it. The read receipt was there. On Thursday, 2 days before the party, my mom called to say something had come up with Tyler. He had a big opportunity, a job interview that he needed help preparing for, and could I maybe push the party to Sunday? I explained, calmly, that I'd already paid a deposit for the trampoline park and invited 12 families. I asked what kind of interview prep took an entire Saturday. My mom got vague and said it was complicated and that Tyler's been under a lot of pressure lately and didn't, I think, just this once, that I could be a little flexible? I said no. For maybe the 3rd time in my adult life, I told my mother no, and I told her the party was happening Saturday with or without them. She said, "We'll see what we can do," in a tone that I now recognize, looking back, as a tone that meant the decision had already been made. Saturday came. The trampoline park was loud and bright and full of 5-year-olds shrieking with joy, and Sophie was glowing in a way that should have made that day one of the best of my life. It mostly was. Mark was there. My in-laws drove 3 hours to be there. My friend Priya brought a cake shaped like a unicorn that Sophie talked about for a month afterward. My parents did not come. Tyler did not come. Nobody called. Nobody texted an apology during the party. I checked my phone twice in the bathroom, telling myself I wasn't checking, and there was nothing. At 6:40 that evening, after the party had ended and we were home unwrapping the last of the gifts with Sophie sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. It said, "Hope it went well." Tyler's interview ran long. We're exhausted. Talk tomorrow? I stared at that message for a full minute. I thought that was the worst part of the day. I was wrong. The next morning, my mom called at 9 a.m. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered anyway, out of some old, deep habit I hadn't fully broken. She asked how the party was, in a breezy voice, like nothing unusual had happened. I told her, flatly, that it was great, that Sophie had a wonderful time with the people who showed up. There was a pause on the line. Then she said the thing that I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "Don't make this a thing, Rachel." I said, "Make what a thing? You missed your granddaughter's birthday." And she said, "We have other priorities right now." 4 words. Other priorities. Not us. Not Tyler's job search alone. Not anything urgent or explainable. Just a flat statement that, on the list of things my parents were managing, my daughter's 5th birthday hadn't made the cut. I didn't say anything back. I just sat there with the phone against my ear, listening to her breathe, waiting for her to say something else, some apology, some explanation that would make this make sense. She didn't. She moved on to ask if I'd seen the score of some game on TV the night before, as if we'd just finished talking about the weather. I hung up a few minutes later and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Mark found me there. He didn't say "I told you so." He just sat down across from me and waited. "What did she say?" he finally asked. I told him. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Rachel, I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually hear it this time. They didn't forget. They chose. There's a difference." I had no idea, sitting at that table on a Sunday morning, that I was about to find proof of exactly how long and how deliberately that choosing had been going on. 2 days later, my mom called again. This time, she didn't ask about the birthday. She got straight to the point. "Rachel, we need to talk about something. Tyler has an opportunity to start his own small business. A detailing service, cars, real promising margins, and he needs about $2,000 to get the equipment and the licensing sorted. We were hoping you could help." I sat there holding the phone, and something in me went very still and very clear in a way it hadn't in 6 years. $2,000, I repeated. "It's an investment, really," she said. "He's finally serious about this one." I asked her, carefully, when exactly Tyler had become serious about this, given that 2 days earlier he'd been too busy with a job interview to attend his niece's birthday party. There was a silence on the line, and then my mother said, in a slightly sharper tone, "That's not fair, Rachel. You know how hard things have been for him." I told her I needed to think about it, and I hung up before she could respond, which was unusual enough that she texted 20 minutes later asking if everything was okay. I didn't answer that text. Instead, I sat down at my laptop and did something I had genuinely never done in 6 years of sending my parents money. I opened my bank app and pulled every single transfer I had ever sent them, going back to that first $1,500 in March of 2018. I built a spreadsheet. I am an accountant. Building a spreadsheet is the one thing in this story I am professionally qualified to do, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Date, amount, stated reason. I filled in 6 years of rows. The total, as I mentioned, came to $97,400. Then I did something I almost didn't do. I called my Aunt Carol, my dad's younger sister, who I knew still talked to my parents, but who had always treated me kindly and fairly, without the weird family math everyone else seemed to be running. I told her what had happened with the birthday and the $2,000 request, and I asked her, point blank, if she knew anything about how Tyler's finances actually worked. There was a long pause. Then Carol said, "Rachel, honey, I think it's time somebody told you something." I had no idea what was coming. I thought I had braced myself for the worst version of this conversation. I was still wrong. Carol told me that 2 years earlier, at a family dinner I hadn't attended because Sophie was sick, my dad had made a joke. The kind of joke that isn't really a joke, about how lucky they were that I was so easy to ask, because, in his words, Rachel never says no. Carol said the table had laughed. She said she hadn't laughed, and she'd felt sick about it ever since, but she hadn't known how to bring it up to me without it seeming like she was stirring up trouble. Then she told me the part that actually changed everything. She said that the previous Christmas, my mom had mentioned to her, in passing, that the mortgage money I sent every month had been covering far more than the mortgage for at least 2 years, that a chunk of it had been quietly redirected to cover a private loan my parents had taken out specifically to help Tyler with a business idea that had failed within 4 months, a loan they hadn't told me about. Because, in my mother's words to Carol, Rachel would have asked too many questions. I asked Carol to repeat that last part because I needed to hear it twice to believe it. She did. Word for word, as close as she could remember. After I got off the phone with Carol, I did something else I'd never done. I called my dad's old college roommate, a man named Frank, who had become a kind of informal family friend over the decades and who, I knew, had co-signed a small personal loan for my parents back in 2021. Something I only knew about because I'd overheard a fragment of a phone call once and never asked further. Frank, who is in his late 60s and has never been the type to dance around a question, told me everything without hesitation once I asked directly. Yes, there had been a loan for $6,500 taken out in the fall of 2021. Yes, it had been used, according to what my parents told him at the time, to help Tyler get back on his feet after a layoff. Yes, the monthly payments on that loan had been built into the household budget my parents managed, the same budget I was sending $1,500 a month into. In other words, for at least part of those 6 years, money I sent specifically because my parents told me they were struggling to cover their mortgage had, instead, been quietly used, in part, to service a debt they'd taken on to fund my brother's repeated failures, none of which they had ever told me about. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in this story more than outrage does. I'm not saying every dollar I sent went to Tyler. The mortgage was real. The shoulder surgery was real. My dad's job loss was real. But the picture that had been presented to me, a struggling, transparent family doing its best, was not the full picture. A meaningful piece of what I sent had been redirected, deliberately, without my knowledge, to prop up a pattern my parents had decided, somewhere along the way, was simply how things worked. Rachel gives, Tyler receives, and Rachel doesn't get to know the difference. I sat with that for one entire night before I did anything. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I just felt very, very calm, in a way that scared Mark a little when he saw it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to stop," I said. Quietly. No warning. The following Monday, I logged into my bank's app and canceled the automatic transfer that had gone out on the 1st of every month for 6 years. I didn't call to tell them. I didn't send a text explaining my reasoning. I had spent 6 years explaining myself, justifying every yes, and I was done doing that work for free. I also called Frank back and asked him, carefully, whether he'd be willing to share copies of any paperwork related to that 2021 loan, since his name was on it as a cosigner and he had every right to keep records. He said he still had the original loan documents in a folder and would scan them for me if it would help. It would help more than he knew. For the rest of that month, nothing happened. No calls, no texts. I assumed, at first, that the November mortgage payment had simply gone through on autopilot in my parents' minds, the way it had for 6 years, and that the absence hadn't registered yet. It registered on December 3rd, when my mom called, sounding confused rather than upset. "Rachel, did something happen with the transfer?" "The mortgage payment didn't come through this month." I told her, calmly, that I had stopped the transfers and that I wasn't going to be sending money going forward. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Rachel, you can't just stop. We're counting on that money," I said. "I know. That's actually the problem." She didn't understand what I meant, and I didn't explain it to her then. I wasn't ready to lay out everything I knew. I was waiting for the right moment, and I already had a pretty good idea of when that moment would be. That moment came 3 weeks later, at Christmas. Every year, my parents hosted Christmas Eve dinner, and every year, I cooked most of it, because my mother didn't have the energy and Tyler wasn't really a kitchen person. This year, I still went. I still brought a dish, a sweet potato casserole Sophie likes to help stir. But I also brought a manila folder. The house was full. My parents, Tyler, Aunt Carol, my dad's brother Gene and his wife, a couple of cousins. Sophie was running around with her cousins near the tree. Mark sat next to me, quiet, present, the way he always is when he knows something is coming. About 40 minutes into dinner, my mom brought it up in front of everyone, which I think she did on purpose, assuming a room full of family would pressure me into folding the way it always had before. "Rachel," she said, setting down her fork, "we really need to talk about the mortgage situation. Things have gotten tight without that help." I felt every eye at the table land on me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech about betrayal or sacrifice. I just reached down, picked up the folder, and set it on the table. "I actually want to talk about that," I said, "because I found out some things this month that I think everyone here should probably hear." I opened the folder. I laid out, one page at a time, 6 years of transfer records totaling $97,400. I laid out Frank's loan documents, the $6,500 loan from 2021 with my parents' signatures on it, used. According to Frank's notes and my mother's own words to Carol, to cover Tyler's failed business attempt. I mentioned, evenly, what Carol had told me about the dinner joke, about my dad saying I never say no. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just let the documents sit there on the table between the green beans and the cranberry sauce, and I let people read them. The table went quiet in a way I had never heard it go quiet before. My Uncle Gene picked up the loan paperwork first, read it twice, and looked up at my dad. "Roger," he said, "is this true? You took out a loan to cover Tyler's business and didn't tell Rachel while she was paying your mortgage?" My dad didn't answer right away. My mom did, instead, in a voice that had gone thin and defensive. "It wasn't like that. We were going to tell her eventually. We didn't want her to worry." "She was sending you $1,500 a month," Jean said. "I think she had a right to worry." Tyler, who had been quiet through all of this, finally spoke up. "This isn't fair. You're trying to embarrass me in front of everyone." I looked at him and said, the closest thing to a raised voice I allowed myself that whole night, "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Tyler. I'm trying to stop paying for you without my knowledge. Those are different things." My cousin Megan, who had been mostly silent, picked up the spreadsheet and started reading line by line, and I watched her face change as she got further down the page. She looked up at my mom and said quietly, "Aunt Diane, this says she paid for Uncle Roger's shoulder surgery and missed her own daughter's birthday party 2 weeks ago because you guys didn't show up. Did you really tell her not to make it a thing?" My mom didn't answer that one at all. The questions kept coming, gentle at first, then less gentle, from people who had spent 20 years assuming the family ran the way my parents always described it. That I was simply the responsible one who liked to help, rather than someone who had been quietly carrying a debt that was never really hers in the first place. By the time dessert would have been served, nobody was eating dessert. My dad sat with his hands folded, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. My mom kept saying, "This isn't how I wanted this to go," which I noticed was not the same thing as saying she was sorry. The 4 words came back to me in that moment, the ones she'd said on the phone after Sophie's birthday. Other priorities. Sitting there at that table, watching my family's version of events fall apart in real time, I finally understood what those 4 words had actually meant, and what they had always meant, going back to a 14-year-old girl buying her own school supplies while her brother got a new bike. I'm not going to pretend the rest of that night was some triumphant scene. It wasn't. My mom cried, not in a way that felt like remorse exactly, more like the particular grief of watching a long-running arrangement collapse. My dad said almost nothing the rest of the evening. Tyler left before dessert would have been served, slamming the front door hard enough that the wreath fell off it. But something real did happen in that room. Carol came and sat next to me and put her hand over mine. Gene told me, quietly, that he'd help if I ever needed anything, and that he meant it differently than my parents ever had. Not as a transaction, but as an offer with no strings on it. Megan asked if she could take a picture of the spreadsheet for the record, and I let her. We left a little after 9. Sophie fell asleep in her car seat before we hit the highway, still wearing the little reindeer headband Carol had brought her. Mark reached over and took my hand at a red light and said, "You okay?" "I don't know yet," I told him honestly. But I didn't yell. I didn't lie. I just told the truth and let them deal with it. "That's more than okay," he said. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was exactly as unglamorous as real fallout usually is. My parents, without my $1,500 a month, had to actually sit down and restructure their finances for the first time in 6 years. My dad picked up 2 more shifts at the hardware store. My mom went back to full-time hours at the dental office, something she'd told me for years wasn't possible because of her schedule, and which apparently became very possible once the alternative was losing the house. Tyler did not get the detailing business off the ground. He moved in with a friend in Columbus a few months later, and from what Carol tells me, he's working at a warehouse now, which is more consistent than anything he's held down in years. I don't know if that's growth or just necessity. Maybe it doesn't matter which. My parents called a few times in January, alternating between asking if I'd reconsider and asking, with less and less patience, why I was still upset about something that had already been dealt with. I told them, each time, the same thing. That I loved them, that I wasn't trying to punish anyone, but that I was done being the family's emergency fund, and that any relationship going forward would have to be based on honesty rather than automatic transfers. My mom called on Sophie's actual half-birthday in May. A small, odd gesture, but one that told me something had shifted in her, even if she couldn't quite say it directly. She didn't ask for money. She asked how Sophie was doing in kindergarten. We talked for 15 minutes about nothing important, and it was the first conversation we'd had in years that didn't have an invoice hiding inside it. I'm not going to tell you everything is fixed. It isn't. My dad still struggles to apologize directly. I think some part of him still believes the money was simply what family does, without registering the imbalance in who was doing and who was receiving. But the automatic transfer is gone. The folder exists, and everyone in that family now knows it exists, which has a way of keeping conversations honest that nothing else ever did. Mark has been steady through all of it, the way he's been steady since our 3rd date all those years ago. He never once told me he'd been right, even though he had been, for nearly a decade. The night after Christmas, when I finally let myself cry about it, not at the dinner table, but later, at home, after Sophie was asleep. He just sat with me on the couch and didn't try to fix anything. He just said, "You did the hard part. The rest is just time." I think about that a lot now, on the days when it still feels strange not to have that monthly transfer leave my account, like a phantom ache where a bill used to be. What I think about most, almost a year later, isn't the spreadsheet or the loan documents or even the 4 words my mother said on the phone. It's something Eleanor told me on that porch back in 2022, the night she asked why I was still doing this. She also told me, almost as an afterthought, something I didn't fully understand until much later. The people who actually love you, Rachel, don't keep a tally. They don't need you to keep one either. For 6 years, I was the only one keeping the tally, and I didn't even know my parents were quietly keeping a different one of their own, in the dark, behind my back. The day I finally laid both tallies on the table, side by side, in front of the whole family, was the day the arrangement finally had to answer for itself. Sophie turned 6 this past November. We had the party at the same trampoline park. My parents came this time, on time, with a present Sophie actually wanted. Tyler sent a text that morning wishing her happy birthday, which is more than he managed the year before. It's not the ending I would have written for myself 10 years ago, back when I still believed that enough sacrifice would eventually be recognized, eventually repaid in kind. It's a smaller, quieter ending than that. But it's an honest one, and honest, I've learned, is worth more than the $97,400 ever was. The people who love you do not keep score. I just had to stop being the only one who knew the score existed.